Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for Webinar Wednesday. My name is Dr. Hilda Billups, and I currently serve as the director of the Webinars Committee for TACUSPA. You will notice we have changed the format for this webinar just a bit. For this webinar, we will recap Chapter 6, Supporting Student Leaders Who Care for Others, from the book Cultivating Trauma-Informed Practice in Student Affairs by Dr. Tricia Shawka. Allow me to introduce our facilitator for today's book club recap, Josh Meredith. Josh joins us from the University of South Alabama and Mobile, Alabama, but he started his higher education career in Texas as Director of Student Life at South Plains College in Levelland, Texas. He is now at South Alabama serving as Associate Director of Student Activities, an opportunity he found through his TACUSPA network after getting involved in the association. He was selected as a 2023 Thomas Morman Fellow and served as chair of the Webinars Committee from 2023 to 2024. I am grateful to Josh for his leadership of the Webinars Committee. He handed over to me a rich collection of resources and materials, which has made my work as a director much easier. Josh has both an undergraduate degree in business management as well as a master's degree in higher education and student development from Taylor University. Though he now resides in Mobile, Josh is originally a Hoosier from the state of Indiana. In his free time, he enjoys running, spending time with friends, and reading a good book. We are very excited to have Josh serve as our facilitator for this book club recap and are thankful to each of you for viewing this recap. I will now turn our webinar over to Josh.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And yes, I am a native Hoosier. And I think since our last time we were on one of these calls, our beloved Indiana Hoosiers have won a national championship in football of all things. So I have to put that on this recorded webinar to get it out there. Go Hoosiers. We're a basketball school, but somehow became a football school. But we're not here to talk about the Indiana Hoosiers today. We're here to talk about this book, Cultivating Trauma-Informed Practice in Student Affairs by Tricia R. Shawka. And so for those who may be watching for the first time or maybe haven't tuned in to any of our other discussions or recaps, we're on chapter 6 today. But I'm going to back up and just briefly give kind of a recap, structured overview with some select quotes of the previous chapters briefly. And if you're following along, these are just going to be the section headers and subheaders with some select substance pulled out from those chapters. So, chapter one covered what is trauma. The author discussed how might we think about trauma, sources of trauma, responses, our responses to trauma and traumatization, and then struggling with the question of does it count? I experienced this, but not that. Does my experience count? Chapter two was titled, What Might It Be Like for a College Student to Experience Trauma? So, specifically, as student affairs practitioners, the groups, populations that we work with, what might it be like for them to experience trauma? And I pulled out this really good quote. The only way forward in supporting students who have experienced trauma is to engage mindfully with our own discomforts and work to educate ourselves and understand just what it might be like for college students to experience trauma. So a deepening, a greater compassion. And she gets to this question later, but what else might be going on? I think summarizes that neatly. But in chapter two, she discusses what do we need to be aware of about trauma in the lives, so maybe previous trauma or recent trauma, external forces that shape a college student's experiences, such as privilege and oppression, social discourse about trauma, and then social constructs of identity. So, one example I think was, a hetero male being tough and, oh, can't feel their feelings and I got to be tough and power through it. All those different factors of a social construct of what it means to be XYZ identity, and how that plays into our response to trauma. She also writes in chapter two how trauma changes everything, such as identity, relationships, even how we negotiate and move through the environment based on how others respond to us. And this includes belonging in community. And then she concludes by asking that question, what else might be going on when we see others respond in a space? Instead of reacting, to stop and ask, what else might be going on. Chapter 3, she writes about what does it mean to be trauma informed. She writes about this idea of being trauma informed versus trauma neutrality, of taking that step back and actually cause harm at worst. And at best, it doesn't really help our students. She asked the question, what is trauma informed practice in higher education? Um, or why is trauma informed practice important in higher education? If I can read my own handwriting there. She discusses what is a trauma informed practice. She writes that it has sort of two basic tenets: supporting and then not re traumatizing. So, working actively to support students, but then also that our actions do not re trigger or re traumatize our students. She writes, trauma-informed practice is a response to the reality that many individuals are impacted by trauma and have experienced potentially traumatic experiences in their lives. She goes on, taking knowledge about trauma to directly inform and shape our policies. So she defines a trauma-informed practice as taking knowledge about trauma and not just reading a book, but actively using it to support policies and practices in our work. She discusses a few models of trauma-informed practice, Vinay's six principles, and then the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA's four R's. And then she puts forth her own model, advancing a model of trauma-informed practice, which includes being holistic, power conscious, focused on relationships, committed to knowledge building. It's harm reducing, and then committed to wellness centered decision making in practice. She asks how we take all this and put it into practice, and that it's important to think not just individually in my line of work, but also systematically, that this world we live in, that we work in daily, higher education, there's a system at play, and factors within that system can affect students and how they experience and respond to trauma. Chapter 4, she discusses personal practices for trauma-informed student affairs work. She discusses useful attitudes and ways of being, recognizing our impact, the ways I move through the world impact those around me who have survived trauma. She discusses approaching trauma-informed practice as a way of being, and she gives a few different ways of being, such as nurturing a sense of humanness, seeing those impacted by trauma as whole beings, and number 3, arriving with compassionate curiosity and asking that question, what else might be going on here? She discusses developing knowledge and skills, says that those are necessary scaffolding as part of our support systems, secondary traumatic stress and responding to hearing about others' traumas or seeing others' traumas. Um, she discusses self-care and how self-care is not just an individual responsibility, but systemic, that if the work we create is limiting the ability of self-care to fill our cup or re-energize us or keep us whole, that there might be some systemic issues at play. Chapter 5, we discussed, or the author writes about supporting students who have experienced trauma. Quote, this is from page 83. Our most powerful support can be as simple as how we show up with others and how we listen. The meaningful difference happens in those simple acts, how we show up for others and how we listen. She writes about framing the scope of our work, of how we're not counselors, that we are sort of the everything else, that while we listen to students in here, it's an important reminder that we are not professional. Well, some of us might be, but I certainly am not a professional counselor in my role, and many of us are not, but we are adjacent to it. And it's important just to be mindful of the scope of our work. She gives some specific practices for supporting students, such as nurturing relationships, being present, addressing issues of safety and control, attending to complications of disclosure, of revealing a traumatic experience or trauma that has happened, mindfully providing resources and support, holding space for growth. She discusses the complexities of supporting students. She discusses mattering and creating environments where students matter and can be heard. And then that sets us up for chapter 6. We've only got a few more chapters left to round out this book. And chapter 6 is another good one. titled Supporting Student Leaders Who Care for Others. In chapter 6, she starts with the quote from Spider-Man: "With great power comes great responsibility," and how we have adapted that in our careers, in student affairs, but then also in how we approach and work with student leaders. Um, Writing that we have dispositions, that we are interconnected. I think many of us would agree that we cultivate work, or we try and cultivate a sense in our students that we are an integrated and interconnected community, and that we have responsibilities to one another, right? We are not just students taking information and putting it down on a test somewhere, but we're in this ecosystem of higher education that we live and work and study alongside others, and we have responsibilities to others. But she specifically wants to address some of the problems that, while our student leaders are, they're excellent, and they sometimes surprise us with just how awesome they are, they're not superheroes. And so that's kind of how we frame this chapter to begin with. She starts by writing about conceptualizing the role of student leaders. She writes of her own experience in being a student leader, and writes how it can have a transformational impact. On page 110, when I think back on my college experience, there were numerous transformational experiences, but some of the most profound were those in which I was a peer leader. So, from her own experience, writing about just how transformational it can be for students in positions of peer leadership, RAs, or, I oversee a student activities board. If you hear doors slamming in the background, they're preparing for a big event today. Um, Being in those roles can be transformational, but also need to be mindful of where exactly the boundaries are. Um, that in the cases of RAs, they're often the first, she writes, often the first to respond to crises even before police arrive or anyone. They're there, they're next door, they're living on the same floor, in the same dorm, or in the same building. And they're often the first to respond. And so it's important for us to know, um, as in the example, she gives an example of the student Margot, who was on a phone team calling alumni and, I guess, asking for money, but had one disgruntled alumni that just laid into her and said all these things, and it was a really traumatic experience. But in her role, had to just move on to the next call. And so, how can we, asking this question, how can we create space for our students to have a boundary when things come up in their work, that they have the space and capability to not have to move on to that next phone call, but to take space, to step away, to process what happened and get support if needed. She goes on and writes about the dangers of the superhuman. She calls it the superhuman construction, in relation to trauma. The expectation that our student leaders are, quote unquote, not like other students, and that we place higher expectations on them. And she specifically notes that her argument isn't to remove expectation from students, but to bring a more balanced approach to our expectation for students. That it's important to remind ourselves that they are human and students, that they're not superhuman, they're not superheroes, that while they balance, a course load and they serve in important leadership roles, that um, they're humans and they're students, and they have limitations, and that we need to bring a holistic approach to our work with them. In the next section in this chapter, she gives recommendations for training and supporting student leaders through a trauma lens. She writes, quote, "Effective training and support come first by establishing edges and boundaries." Let me find my spot here. Um, Effective training and support of student leaders who may be exposed to trauma come first by establishing some edges and boundaries for their roles. That boundary work includes us clearly conceptualizing the edges of our expectations of student in those roles. Then we must make sure we provide adequate supports to help students stay within those boundaries. So starting first by our conceptualizations and how we frame what their role is. Um, I don't want to just brush over this in the outline. I know for me in my office, that's something we've been working through as a team. Where does their role end? If XYZ happens, is it someone else's responsibility to step up or fill in or take on additional responsibilities because someone else didn't fill that gap? I don't work with a team of RAs who are responding to some of the situations that housing and residence life staff might respond to, but it's important to discuss that. Where does my work end? What's a healthy balance to when things happen? Where do I draw the line? Where's the boundary so that I can take care of me? She writes that it's important that we teach our student leaders about trauma. Um, and she gives, uh, let's see, she said, teaching student leaders about trauma includes both educating about how trauma impacts those who experience it and two, or B, preparing them for their own personal responses to secondary trauma. So both educating them on what they might be seeing in their peers, but also supporting them and helping them prepare for preemptively, not retroactively, um, how they might respond when they confront certain situations. She writes that it's important that we present information, not just checking a box and saying, well, we covered this in our leadership training in July, uh, but that presenting it sometimes multiple times across time in ways that students can easily understand and digest it. That maybe you do a training in August and then another training in October and another in December so that students can stitch together what they're learning, but also connect it to their experiences, kind of weave together a foundation of what they're learning. And then she also writes it's important to strengthen connection between groups. I don't want to brag, but that's something that I've really been working on with my students, that we work with so many other groups on campus. We work with housing residence life. We work with the student center staff. We work with so many other groups, and that's important for us to know who they are and have those connections so that we can know, hey, the Counseling and Wellness Center wants to work on a program to connect students to resources. They've got this problem and they're trying to address it by X, Y, and Z. Having those relationships is so important. She writes about preparing student leaders for working with trauma survivors, that it's important that we help leaders, one, recognizing their own limitations, but two, how to articulate to others. This was on page 118. So if anyone's following along, this is kind of the second paragraph here. How do we help student leaders develop sufficient self-awareness, confidence, and self-advocacy skills to be able to A, recognize personal limits of what they're able to confront and what they aren't, and B, articulate that to others? This is where there can be challenges in climates of quote unquote those higher standards that you referred to earlier, because these cultures may inadvertently send messages that it's a peer leader's job to be able to handle any kind of crisis, that we've just got to get through it. I forget if it's earlier or later, but she gives the example of an RA who was aware that there's a student who was working through like suicide ideation and was on high alert, and the student wasn't sleeping. They were at this other student's door listening to make sure that they could hear the student, that the student was alive, and they had this deep compassion and care to take care of their resident and their peer. But also, where was it not communicated with that student that sleeping outside their door, having this, lack of any boundary at all with their work, is dramatically unsustainable. So it's important that we equip our students um, to know those limitations, but then also to be empowered and to articulate and to ask for help. And um, I think it's so vital. Uh, she goes on that it's important to create structures for pause and reflection, that we do the training, we do our work, but to create moments to stop and pause and look back and reflect on, okay, what have I learned? What did I work through? Can I talk about that with others? Do I need to, go to a professional counselor, or do I need to just unpack it with my supervisor? Um, she gives an example of Brene Brown and our responses, and she discusses empathetic versus traumatic engagement of kind of in creating that boundary of simply um, empathetic engagement is holding space and sitting with others as they share with us versus trying to really imagine it from their perspective and kind of taking on that trauma of it's important that we have that empathetic engagement, that we can hold space and sit with others and hold, that compassionate space, but it's also understanding that it's not ours to take on. Um, and then to kind of counter that, she goes on and writes and gives us two different exercises for releasing trauma. So if we work in environments where we're constantly taking on trauma of others, she writes, these are ways of helping our bodies know what is ours to hold and what is the trauma of others. And so I'm actually going to read these. They're lengthy, somewhat lengthy paragraphs, but I thought it would be good since we're recording this and putting it on YouTube to read these for our audiences to come back to. So, exercise number one that the author gives is visualization for releasing. She writes, find a comfortable standing or sitting position. Begin by closing your eyes if that's comfortable to you, or leaving them open with a soft gaze, not focusing on anything in particular. Take a few moments to focus on your breath. Next, imagine the trauma that you've heard and or learned about from others within your body. For some, it might be helpful to feel sensations of that information in the body. For others, it might be helpful to imagine a visual representation of where and how that information is in the body. Oh, sorry. It might be helpful to imagine a sound that represents that information in the body. Then to begin to imagine all that trauma information in terms of the feelings, the visualization, or the sound as leaving your body out of your elbows or the bottoms of your feet. Or for me, it's through my breath. Powerful exhale. Exercise number two is visualization for putting in a box. Again, she writes, find a comfortable position, seated or laying down. Close your eyes if that's comfortable to you, or leave your eyes open with a soft gaze, not focusing on anything in particular. Begin by imagining a box. It can be any kind of box you want. The box is as big or as small as you need it to be. You can imagine decorating it by adding colors or bows or whatever you want. Next, imagine the trauma that you've been exposed to or the emotions or memories related to it that might be challenging at various points. Take any and all of those things that might be feeling like too much or too much for right now and invite them inside that lovely box that you've decorated. As you engage in this process, imagine and notice those thoughts going into the box without feeling you need to force them into the box. Then imagine a room that feels safe and inviting with a shelf or closet where you can go and place that box. Then gently and mindfully imagine placing your box on that shelf with love, knowing that you can return to the box and go through its contents whenever you want. But you're also able to put it away when you need to, too. And she notes, if the visualization is something that feels a bit too abstract, another way to do this activity is in terms of using an actual physical box and then writing down some of those overwhelming thoughts or feelings on pieces of paper and putting them inside the box. Um, so if you're following along, I hope that you can get a copy of the book and that you can utilize those exercises. And we'll come back to that here in a minute. I've got some questions for our audience watching online. To round up the chapter, she writes about creating intentional and effective support for student leaders after exposure to trauma. She writes about the importance of minimizing the negative impacts of trauma, um, being attentive to our role as supervisors and advisors, and actively working to minimize the negative impacts student leaders may encounter in relation to trauma exposure. She discusses the idea from the World Health Organization about psychological first aid. That's an approach that listens but doesn't pressure others to share, and that it's simply one approach, but by no means the only way to offer support, nor will it be the best approach in every situation. But she offers it as a resource to us. Psychological first aid is an approach, this is on page 122 and 123, is an approach to listening and engaging engaging needs, but importantly, it is not one that pressures a person to talk about their experience or analyze it. She writes that there's three key elements that it's predicated on. One, that individuals feel safe and connected to others, calm and hopeful. Two, that they have access to social, physical, and emotional support. And then three, that they regain a sense of control by being able to help themselves. She goes on, the psychological, I will keep wanting to say PFA, but psychological first aid is intended to be used in the aftermath of a crisis when individuals are still in distress. So this isn't a month later, 2 months later. This is in the immediate aftermath. And that there are four components. So those three predications, there's four components in engaging in psychological first aid: prepare, look, listen, and link. In the prepare phase, this is where helpers, so those of us who might be, working with students, or this is for our student leaders who might be exposed, uh, to familiarize themselves with the basic details about the crisis. So, acquaint themselves with available supports and resources and gauge concerns about safety and security. Phase two, helpers engage in some basic assessment, assess the environment for safety before engaging with others with psychological first aid. Phase three, helpers then listen. They intentionally approach those who are distressed and create space to simply listen to those individuals. But again, not pressuring them to share, just creating the space that if they would like, they can listen. And then by attentively listening, the fourth phase is linking. Helpers are attentive to connection based on what they may have learned through looking and listening. Helpers work to connect students in distress to useful resources and support. So this is one approach. It's not the only approach. There's some factors at play that she writes about, but it's an approach that we can use with our students. And then to round out the chapter, she writes about providing ongoing supports for students. She writes that there are some practical considerations that in the aftermath of trauma exposure, student leaders may need relatively straightforward supports, particularly in terms of helping them restore a sense of safety and balance, that we must ensure student leaders feel safe. This could include, changing where they live, working with housing to maybe relocate, um, or working with, Title IX or a conduct office to put some protective orders in place and create distance from certain individuals. And then two, it's useful to acknowledge what has happened. Sometimes, she writes, the temptation for institutions and institutional actors is to try to get quote unquote back to normal as if nothing happened. Although that was an important reminder that, as she writes earlier in the book, trauma changes everything, and that we cannot simply go on as if nothing happened. That it's still important to acknowledge what happened. And then finally, she writes, you can consider the structural mechanisms to provide student leaders with the kind of support they need to reestablish not normalcy, but equilibrium. She writes about the importance of peer mentorship, creating spaces where peer leaders can share about their traumatic experiences, Um, Creating spaces where peer leaders can share about the traumatic exposure they have experienced in the past creates numerous important conditions. One, it can help newer leaders gain valuable insights from more experienced leaders. Two, it helps normalize the experience in ways that the newest student leaders can hear from experienced leaders about their own struggles. And then finally, she writes about the importance of creating space for humor and play. I thought this was an excellent reminder. Um, she references Vanderkolk because the nervous system after trauma becomes consumed with navigating feelings of chaos and unsafety. So, an antidote that is creating opportunities. Thus, part of long-term support after trauma exposure is that of creating opportunities for enjoyment and spontaneity again. So that's how she rounds out chapter 6. Lots, as usual, lots in this chapter, a very dense chapter. But I wanted to leave our audience with just a few questions, kind of based on what we've covered here. Number one, kind of going back to the beginning, how are we going to work to create healthy boundaries with our student leaders? What in particular about their job description or training or how we communicate our expectations to them? What might you need to change as we are looking towards a new cycle? My group is getting ready to post an application and hire for the 26-27 school year. What might we need to change about how we onboard and train and frame the expectations of our student leaders? Number two, the exercises we did together. How can you incorporate those, into your own work, into your own personal practice with your student leaders? And what other resources might be out there? I know I've really enjoyed learning through my own, personal therapist grounding exercises that have been really helpful in terms of preparing and how we prepare and show up for others, or how we show up and listen. Part of showing up for me is being grounded and creating a sense of safety for students. So, how can we incorporate those two exercises, and what are the resources? And then those three ongoing supports at the end. I thought the final reminder was really, really important, and something I try to do. I mean, I have fun decorations in my office and whatnot, but we've got board games. We've got what are you doing to create conditions for play and spontaneity, that it's not all about work, it's not all about the training, it's not all about, the checklist for today, but how can we create conditions for play and spontaneity in our offices and our work, and in how we serve students and them working through, um, experiences of trauma and supporting student leaders who are on the quote unquote front lines and serving our students. So that's the overview I've prepared for you all today. Thank you, Hilda, for giving me the opportunity to. This has been tremendously beneficial and helpful for me personally to read through and study this book, and prepare to share it with others. And I'm grateful. So thanks, y'all, for joining.
Josh, thank you once again for serving as our facilitator for this recap. I am so glad that you found this book impactful and useful for you. I've enjoyed reading through it as well. And so we encourage each of you, if you've not yet picked up a copy of this book, so please go to your university or your college's library and check out a copy. We believe this book will be impactful and will change the way you work with your students. As we close today, I have a few reminders. These links will be in the description of the video. Visit our YouTube channel for our webinar recordings. If you're interested in presenting or serving as a panelist for a future webinar Wednesday, please complete the proposal form. It's time for membership or membership year renewals. The TACUSPA membership year runs from January to December. If you've not yet become a member of TACUSPA, we encourage you to join us or to renew your membership. Thank you for viewing one of 4 Webinar Wednesday opportunities for February 2026. Last Wednesday on February 4th, Dr. Suzanne Harris shared her thoughts on leadership. Next Wednesday on February 18th, we are pleased to repeat one of the favorite sessions from our 2025 Fall Conference, Micro Misbehaviors, Macro Consequences, Setting the Tone for Student Conduct. On the following Wednesday, February 25th, we'll give you the opportunity to learn more about the Thomas Mormon Fellows Program. You may find Webinar Wednesday recordings on our YouTube channel. Thank you and have a great day.